There are certain places in this world we almost always feel safe. Our homes generally come in at number one, our workplace often at number two. In the tragic and troubling death of 34-year-old Lorraine Kirkley, called Lori by friends and family, both of these two spaces would become places of danger. On July 21st, 1999, Lori, a cardiac nurse, had a typical day. She headed home to the house that she shared with her husband in Valparaiso, Indiana. Within 20 minutes, Lori would be forced from her home and led to her horrific rape and murder. Her killer would turn out to be someone Lori knew all too well. Welcome to Bitter Endings, a true crime podcast. I'm your host, J.R. Erickson. In Bitter Endings, I'll bring you stories of those taken too soon, the silent many who no longer have a voice through which to seek justice. The Bitter Endings podcast is sponsored by My Fiction Novels. The Northern Michigan Asylum series are novels that braid elements of haunting and murder mystery, and they're all inspired by a real former asylum here in Traverse City, Michigan, which is where I live. You can find the novels on Amazon.com. in audio format if you are an Audible listener, as well as in ebook and paperback. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Bitter Endings. Just a quick note before we get started on the episode today. I had mentioned in my previous episode that I may not release an episode of Bitter Endings this month because I was in the middle of finishing a book. And fortunately, I was able to get the book, Bitter Ground, to the editor last week, and I am waiting for the edits to come back. So I was able to get a podcast around for this week or an episode around for this week, and I may or may not have another one ready to release in 2 weeks. It just depends on how much editing goes into this book that's coming back, as well as how the launch of the book goes. But hopefully in a couple of weeks, I will have another episode uploaded. Before we move into the final day of Lori's life, let's talk about the good years that came before. Lorraine Ann Jones was born on September 30th, 1964, to William Robert and Patricia Ann Friedrich Jones in Kewanna, Indiana. Lori grew up with her family on a farm in Fulton, Indiana. During high school, she was a member of many clubs and teams, including being president of the Sunshine Society, a member of the drama club, the swing choir, a member of the girls' basketball team, and more. Lori was valedictorian of her class and the recipient of several awards and scholarships, including the Tanya Smith Award, the Sunshine Nursing Scholarship, a Hoosier Scholarship, and a Purdue University Scholarship. She graduated from Caston High School in 1983. Lori knew from a young age that she wanted to be a nurse. She loved to help people. Her mother later said when Lori's grandfather was hospitalized during her childhood, she regularly visited the hospital and learned about the role of nurses. She was forever after interested in joining their ranks. After high school, Lori went on to Purdue University, where she received a Bachelor of Science degree in nursing. She graduated with distinction in 1987. On June 25, 1988, she married Robert P. Kirkley at the Fulton Baptist Church. He had also attended Purdue University. They would continue to be regular attendees at Fulton Baptist, where Lori taught Sunday school, volunteered as a youth leader, and played the piano. 34-year-old Lori had green eyes and red hair. She stood about 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed 135 pounds. On the day she vanished, she was last seen wearing chino-style pants and a cranberry and white striped short-sleeved sweater. According to Lori's obituary, she was an avid bicyclist. She loved life and lived it to the fullest with enthusiasm, laughter, and energy. She was devoted to helping others. She was employed as a cardiac nurse at the Northwest Indiana Heart Center. Lori's aunt, Connie Jones, described her as, quote, an all-American girl, a wonderful Christian young lady. In the months before her death, Lori was happy and busy. She had a special piano performance at her church on July 25th that she was preparing for. She also went biking in the hilly 100A bicycle tour through the hills around Bloomington and Nashville. Shortly before her murder, Lori and Robert were making plans to relocate to a new home in South Bend, Indiana, where Rob had landed a new engineering job. They were also excited to start a family. She was pursuing a master's degree from Purdue University at Calumet. On February 2, 1999, more than 5 months before she was murdered, Lori and Rob's home was burglarized. The culprit had left behind nude photos and stole a pearl necklace, a Sony digital camera, an RCA video camera, and 2 drills. They also ransacked the home. The culprit left a note alleging that Lori was having an affair. Lori was aghast. She insisted to Robert that she was not having an affair, and her husband didn't think for a moment that she was. Lori was so frightened by the break-in that she changed her routine after the incident. She went on fewer rides with her bicycle group, dropped the class she was taking at Purdue, and she and Rob installed a security system. Unfortunately, none of these changes would save her. So let's wind back the clocks more than 20 years ago to that warm summer evening in Valparaiso, Indiana. It's July 21st, 1999. Lorraine Kirkley went about her usual routine. Before work, she washed the dishes and cleaned up her and Rob's home. It was supposed to be shown by a realtor that day, since they were selling it in preparation to move to South Bend. She worked her normal shift as a cardiac nurse at the Northwest Indiana Heart Center. She completed her shift and headed home at 5 p.m. When she pulled her 1994 green Ford Explorer into the garage, she had no idea a man had crept in not long before her. 15 minutes before Lori arrived, one of Lori's neighbors noticed a man on a bicycle. Oddly, they'd seen this man the day before. As had happened the previous day, the man rode up to Lori's house, lifted the garage door, and disappeared inside. On the day of her killing, the man on the bicycle again rode up to Lori's home and went inside her garage. This time, Lori returned home from work while the man was there. A short time later, the witness saw Lori's Ford Explorer pull out of the garage and drive away. He was unable to see who was behind the wheel. That evening, when Robert returned home from work, he found a disturbing scene. The garage door was open, all the lights were on, and there was no sign of his wife. There was a note taped to the wall in the kitchen that said, quote, "There's a gun pointed at your head." A bloody butter knife lay in the sink, and there was additional blood on the kitchen floor. Robert also found his and Lori's master bedroom was in disarray, and Lori's underwear drawer had been emptied. Robert also noticed that a computer, a camera, and other electronic equipment were missing. He immediately phoned the police. As they searched the house, they found an earring under the refrigerator and a lens from one of Lori's newer pairs of glasses that had popped out and was underneath the oven. All the eyewear that Lori possessed, which she needed to see, was accounted for in the house. None of her luggage was missing. Lori also suffered from asthma, which she took medication for, and she had additional thyroid medication she needed from a previous episode of thyroid cancer. All of her medications were in the house. In the days after she vanished, police searched for any leads regarding her whereabouts. Large land and air searches were conducted, which would go on for months. They received some conflicting tips from neighbors in Lori's subdivision. Someone thought they had seen her around 6:30 p.m., but then they heard the statements from eyewitnesses who had seen the man who rode up to Lori's house on a bicycle and went into her garage, and then saw her Explorer pulling back out of the driveway around 5:30 p.m. Robert informed the police about the February burglary, and they wondered if Lori had come home and interrupted a burglary in action and had been abducted as a result. On July 23rd, 2 days after Lori disappeared, a bag was found outside a local apartment complex. Writing on the bag was addressed to Mr. Kirkley. A note in the bag said, quote, "Please give this letter to Mr. Kirkley. His wife is missing. I'm sorry about your wife. She wouldn't cooperate, even with a .44 Magnum pointed at her head. I tackled her and attempted to cover her mouth. She bit the tip of my finger off. I had no plans to kill her, but unfortunately I had to. You will never find the body." In the bag, police also found Lori's keys as well as one of Lori's biking shoes. On the 24th, Lori's Ford Explorer was found burning in a rural LaPorte cornfield near Westfield, Indiana. The search for Lori immediately attracted media attention, and Porter County Crime Stoppers chose Lori's disappearance as the crime of the week and offered a $1,000 reward leading to an arrest in relation to her case. On July 27th, 6 days after Lori went missing, an arrest was made in her disappearance. David Malinsky is not your usual suspect. The 36-year-old worked as an exercise physiologist with patients at Porter Memorial Hospital. He was married, owned a nice home with a 3-car garage in Chesterton, Indiana. He enjoyed jogging and fishing. He also knew Lori. They'd previously worked together at Porter Memorial Hospital. Police got word of Dave Malinsky's potential involvement from his own wife. Kelly Malinsky called investigators and alerted them to her husband's possible involvement in the break-in that had happened in the Kirkley home the previous February. Kelly told investigators she was afraid that Dave might be involved in Lori's disappearance. Investigators brought Malinsky in for questioning. It didn't take him long to admit that yes, he had burglarized Lori's home in February. He said not only had he done it, but he'd also left the strange notes and lewd photos. He told investigators that he'd done the first burglary as a challenge and that Kirkley was not very smart and she was an easy target, which was quite infuriating when I read that. He also admitted that he broke into her home again on July 21st, the day she disappeared. He even said that he stole her 1994 Ford Explorer and burned it, but he insisted that he didn't have anything to do with her disappearance. During further questioning, he also said that he didn't have any kind of sexual relationship or affair with Lori Kirkley. On July 29th, David Malinsky was charged with 2 counts of burglary, auto theft, and arson. Once David Malinsky learned that police were going to search his house, he changed his story. He claimed now that he and Lori had been having an affair for 6 months and that they'd staged the burglary so she could leave Robert and run away, which was why he'd burned her car. Police searched David Malinsky's home. They seized his computer, and on it they found a document which showed a careful planning of the second burglary of Lori Kirkley's residence, as well as possible alibis to confuse police. On August 4th, Malinsky was charged with Lori's murder. At the same time, Lori's community was desperate for her safe return. The Faith Baptist Church, which she and Rob had attended, held prayer vigils, gathering in groups and praying for Lori's safe return. With Malinsky shedding no light on Lori's whereabouts, police used bloodhounds to search the wooded areas around Malinsky's home, as well as in the LaPorte County field where her burned vehicle was discovered. They found nothing. Despite Malinsky's claims that he was innocent and had nothing to do with Lori's disappearance, he soon incriminated himself. While in jail, David asked a fellow inmate to find and destroy pictures he'd taken of Lori, which he'd disposed of along a roadside near his home in Chesterton. Instead of finding the photos, the inmate told police, who then were able to go out and retrieve the photos along the roadside. The images were chilling. A bound and gagged Lori lay in the master bedroom of David Malinsky. Investigators would continue to interview Malinsky. However, he was not forthcoming, and he would simply not admit to having hurt Lori. On August 4th, Malinsky was charged with murder. His trial started on January 24th in 2000. Deputy Prosecutor Todd Schellenbarger's opening statements were unsettling, to say the least. He began by showing the court a picture of Lori, smiling and healthy. He explained that this was how she'd last looked to her family and friends. He then revealed a photograph of Lori naked, bound, and gagged. He said, quote, "This is what Lori Kirkley looked like inside Malinsky's master bedroom." Another shocking development occurred when jurors observed a slideshow of a bound and gagged Lori in David Malinsky's bedroom being tortured to death. The photos were part of the prosecution's opening statements, and they were damning evidence. Prosecutors described the photos as proof of Dave's dark obsession with Lori. Dave Malinsky had met Lori Kirkley at the Cardiac Rehabilitation Center in Valparaiso, where he worked as an exercise physiologist and she as a nurse. Malinsky arrived in court clean-shaven, wearing a dark suit with a white shirt and a green paisley tie. This was a far cry from Malinsky's mugshot, where he looked quite bedraggled and stared blankly into the camera. He also had a goatee in that original photo. Defense attorneys fought back against the prosecutor's opening statements, saying the photos were merely part of the plan created by Dave and Lori, and she was actually alive and well, living her life elsewhere. Malinsky claimed that his friendship with Kirkley had evolved into a 6-month extramarital affair that lasted until the day of her disappearance. He denied killing her, but he admitted to helping stage a burglary and abduction at her home as part of her secret plan to disappear. This was the foundation of the defense's case, and it was refuted fiercely by the prosecution. In addition to multiple character witnesses who spoke of the happy marriage between Lori and Rob himself took the stand, meticulously going through his and Lori's financial records, proving that there were no large cash withdrawals, which the defense claims Lori had done to fund her escape plan. There were also months of purchases that supported the image of the happy couple, which included Purdue football games they attended together, a book that Lori went to another city to purchase for Rob for his birthday when the copy wasn't available locally, and many dinners and lunches they went to after church or after work. In addition to the defense's claim that Dave and Lori had been having an affair and staged her disappearance, as well as the burglary in February, they also claimed that Dave backed out at the last minute and Lori ran away anyway, which was why he couldn't tell them where she was. Again, despite this claim, prosecution presented witness upon witness who took the stand and described how happy and in love Robert and Lori had always been, including in the weeks leading to her disappearance. More damning evidence against David included when his mother-in-law, Sharon Keating, took the stand. She told the jury that her daughter, Kelly, who was Dave's wife, called her crying and asked her mother to meet with her immediately in the days after Lori disappeared. They met in a parking lot outside of Keating's workplace. Kelly said, quote, "I think he did it. I think he did it to her." Sharon said she didn't immediately understand what Kelly was talking about. She thought perhaps she was referring to David having an affair. When Kelly explained that she was referring to the missing woman, Lorraine Kirkley, Sharon was immediately concerned and thought they should reach out to an attorney friend. They met with attorney Ann Stanley, and they told her about Kelly's fears. The three women then met with Porter County Sheriff's Detective Bureau Commander Mike Veal. During the trial, Dave Malinsky's brother Charles also took the stand. He was a Marine Corps reservist, and he was testifying for the prosecution. He said that Dave was his best friend and that the investigation had devastated their family. He told the jury that his brother came to him on July 27th, 6 days after Lori disappeared, and confessed that he'd done something stupid. He told Charles a chilling story. Dave said that his wife Kelly had found a secret room that Dave had built off the attic where he hung up nude photos of women. He went on to admit he'd been involved in a burglary in February in Porter County that he'd done for the thrill of it and that his wife knew about it. Dave asked Charles several times for a gun, but Charles refused. Charles was concerned his brother might try to commit suicide. Charles also said that Dave had never confessed to killing anyone, and he described his brother as sincere and helpful. Another person to take the stand was a friend of Dave's named Jerry. And Jerry knew both Lori and Dave from his time as a patient in the cardiac rehab where they had both worked. On the stand, Jerry described a conversation he had with Malinsky shortly after Lori disappeared. Jerry admitted that he wished nothing ill on Lori, but feared she was dead. Dave, he said, responded, quote, "Yes, she most certainly is dead." Other witnesses testified to bruises and abrasions on Dave's body shortly after Lori vanished. His coworker, Nancy S., testified that David had a large bruise beneath one of his thumbnails and a scratch across his face. During closing arguments, the prosecutor referred to the Polaroid photos that showed a bound and gagged Kirkley being sexually tortured. He said, quote, "You look at these pictures. Does that look voluntary to you? My goodness, I'll leave that alone. You look at them." Although the prosecution's case was circumstantial, the evidence against Malinsky was expansive. In all, prosecutors presented more than 400 pieces of evidence and dozens of witnesses. Even Malinsky's own family testified against him. On the contrary, the defense team called only a single witness before resting their case. In February of 2000, despite still having not found Lori's body, jurors took just over 2 hours to convict David Malinsky of her murder. Malinsky revealed no emotion when the verdict was read. He was sentenced to 155 years in prison. In May of 2000, Lori was posthumously given the highest honor in the nursing profession, a membership in the Theta Tau International Honor Society at Purdue University at Calumet. Also in May of 2000, Dave Malinsky appealed his murder conviction. His legal team claimed that investigators were desperate to make a case against him. They said authorities did not allow Dave to see a lawyer during his interrogation. They unlawfully searched his cell and illegally copied his legal papers. In total, his attorneys filed a 76-page brief detailing why his conviction should be overturned. His appeal was denied. In September 2005, more than 6 years after Lori's murder, David Malinsky finally gave up the ghost, or in this case, Lori's body. In jail clothing, handcuffed, and escorted by 3 police officers, David led investigators to his father's rural cabin in Jasper County, Indiana, where he said he'd buried Lori's body. The years had muddled his memory, and he couldn't locate the exact spot, but he was able to get close enough, and a team of forensic anthropologists did the rest. His sudden desire, after 6 years of lies, to reveal Lori's body came as a religious experience in jail. Apparently, he had decided he wanted to be a Christian and was advised by the chaplain that in order to do so, he needed to give the family closure. In a statement regarding his crime, Malinsky called his own behavior, quote, selfish, ungodly, and wicked. He blamed the murder on a substance abuse problem as well as an addiction to pornography. Lori's husband, Robert Kirkley, was surprised by Malinsky's choice to reveal her body. He said he never forgot about his wife, but he'd been trying to go on living his life. He also said he was thankful for everyone who had continued praying for new information in Lori's case and for the investigators who had been working to find her body during the previous years. In an interview in the Northwest Indiana Times, Rob said, quote, God works in mysterious ways. Ultimately, the dark deeds of Dave Malinsky became clear. On July 21, 1999, after he abducted, raped, and murdered Lori Kirkley, he drove her to the dense woods surrounding his father's isolated cabin in Jasper County. He brought along a shovel and the dead body of Lorraine Kirkley. Between the hours of midnight and 5 a.m., he dug a 5-foot hole. Fearing that his father might notice what he was up to, he peered often around the garage that lay between Lori's future grave and his father's cabin, making sure his dad didn't come out to see what he was up to. Eventually, the forensic team located Lori's body in the vicinity described by Malinsky. She was identified using dental records, and her autopsy revealed she'd fought with her attacker and eventually had been strangled to death. Lori was officially laid to rest at Fulton Baptist Temple in Fulton, Indiana. 400 people, including family, friends, colleagues, and others in her community, turned out to bid farewell to the slain nurse. So just a few final thoughts on the case of Lori Kirkley. I think one of the things that I really got hung up on when I was reading about this case was the feeling that it was preventable. And, I think it's hard because in reality, all of these cases are preventable, but only if we can predict the future, and we can't. I just found it really heartbreaking that neighbors saw a man go into Lori's house 2 times. I think, what if someone had called her and asked, should this man be around your house? What's going on with this guy that's around your house? Did those neighbors know that Lori and Rob's house had been burglarized earlier in the year, in February? And if they had known, would they have been more likely to let Rob and Lori know that this person had been to the house? Because not only did Dave Malinsky sneak into her home on the day that she was murdered, but he was there the day before as well. I also thought about Dave Malinsky's wife, Kelly. And what if she had gone to the police about the burglary in February? She obviously had known that he had committed that crime. You know, one of the things I think about with these what if scenarios is they all seem to take the responsibility off the real problem here. And the real problem is the perpetrator. In this case, it's David Malinsky. It's easy to say if they'd done this or that, it would have gone differently. But would Malinsky's obsession with Lori have magically disappeared? Or would he have simply found another way? Would he have scheduled a meeting with her? Would he have followed her home from work? Would he have broken in the middle of the night? I think the challenge in situations like this is there's a certain level of awareness and preparedness we can have in our lives, but in some scenarios, such as this one, where you have a coworker who is obsessed and homicidal, there isn't much protection that you can have because this person clearly will stop at nothing to do what he wants to do. He's showing up at your house in broad daylight, in front of neighbors. He's walking into your garage. He's brazen. He broke in months before and left lewd photos. This isn't necessarily a person who's going to be deterred by you getting a large dog or changing up your routine. And in Lori's case, she did do that. She changed her routine and she got a security system, which I was curious about the security system thing, because how did this man access her garage if they had a security system, or perhaps it wasn't on that day? I don't have a lot of additional thoughts about Lori's case, at least not that I'm going to share in the episode today, but I did just find her murder to be a really tragic and heartbreaking one, and a scary one, because this was a person who fixated on her at her workplace and then started terrorizing her in her home, basically, and even eventually abducted her from there. So I think on some level, it's at least a relief that Malinsky came clean and gave up the whereabouts of Lori's body, but ultimately that doesn't bring her back. And that's always the sad reality in these situations, is whatever resolution comes out on the other side, it's still going to be a really sad future for everyone that knew her and loved her. That is it for this episode of Bitter Endings. I thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any comments or case suggestions, please send me an email at bitterendingspodcast@gmail.com. You can also find out all of the resources for this episode and read the show notes and more. Visit my website at www.bitterendingspod.com. You can also find me on Facebook at Bitter Endings Podcast. The Bitter Endings Podcast is sponsored by My Fiction Novels. The Northern Michigan Asylum series are novels that braid elements of haunting and murder mystery, and they're all inspired by a real former asylum here in Traverse City, Michigan, which is where I live. You can find the novels on Amazon.com in audio format if you are an Audible listener, as well as in ebook and paperback. If you enjoyed today's episode of Bitter Endings and you would like to hear more, please consider subscribing to this podcast and also leaving a review. Thanks so much and have an amazing and a safe day. I just want to take a quick minute to also acknowledge the music played in the Bitter Endings podcast. This song is called Disease Tree by Noya Sakamata.